Chapter 5. Alban awoke early the next morning, while his new companion was still sleeping. He carefully slipped out from underneath her hands, and crept very carefully along the top of her chest. Of course he was still naked, and while he didn't mind Valerie looking at him undressed, he wouldn't want any passing travelers catching him in this rather embarrassing state. He climbed down her shoulder and landed on a carpet of her brown hair. For a while he just sat there, inhaling the fresh scent of her hair, and staring at her face next to him, enthralled. It was simply astounding how much bigger she was than him. And he seriously wondered how his life would be like living with her. Soon afterward, he set out quickly towards her bag, which was lying at her side, and walked right into it. In there, he found his shirt, trousers, and boots, which he had put on once. He also took his sword and attached it to his belt. When this was done, he helped himself to some of her food, knowing that she wouldn't mind. "She probably eats more in a day than I do in 10 years, he thought. It's a good thing she has her own castle where she can live. I doubt whether there'd be enough to feed her where I'd stay in Elgon." When he went outside again, he saw that they were not alone anymore, and he quickly drew his sword. A huge gray ogre about 20 feet tall and carrying a stone club was prowling around near Valerie's head. The beast seemed confused by the giant thing that lay before it, and Alban was able to get very close to it before it noticed him. He fought ogres before, but none of them had been this large, and he had no doubt that this one was hungry and looking for fresh meat. The monster noticed him before he could attack it, and turned to face him, snarling loudly. Alban tried to dodge a blow from its club, but after his imprisonment and torture, he wasn't exactly in a monster-fighting condition. The club hit him in the stomach, sending him 30 feet through the air, his sword flying out of his hand, and it landed 15 feet away from him. He began to crawl towards it, but the ogre was much faster than he was, and soon it had him pinned to the ground with its foot. He couldn't move, and as the beast raised its club to kill him, he closed his eyes. All of a sudden, all the weight of the body vanished, and he opened his eyes again. The ogre was no longer on top of him, but dangling 150 feet above him. Valerie had saved him, of course. She'd been awakened by the noise the monster had made, and by Alban's cries, and she jumped to intervene when she saw he was in danger. She grabbed the ogre by its legs, and was now trying to decide what to do with it. It continued to struggle in her grasp, bashing its club against her fingers, which hurt her so much she nearly dropped it. At that moment, she couldn't think what else to do, so she took aim above the surrounding trees and threw the ogre off above them with all her strength. Must have landed nearly a mile away, and Valerie was and Valerie had no doubt that she just killed it. She felt rather bad about it, but it was trying to kill her beloved prince, so she decided that she had done the right thing. She now turned her attention towards Alban, who was still lying at her feet, completely blown away by what he had just seen. She stooped and picked him up, and he sat trembling in her hand, looking at her with awe. "Are you all right?" she asked, and he nodded. "I'm sorry if I scared you, sweetie, but I couldn't leave you to die, could I?" "No. It's just being rescued all the time by a girl who's much bigger and stronger than me. Well, it feels a little uncomfortable." "Well, in that case, I suppose I'll just stop doing it then." "No, please." He looked around for something to hold. He found her thumb and embraced it. I'm really grateful for your help, Valerie. What I told you last night about how I feel, it was the truth. But you must understand, this is all very unusual to me. I mean, where I come from, everyone is taught that it's a man's job to protect his wife, not the other way around. I guess what I'm saying. I'm sa- Suddenly he stopped talking and began to laugh. She looked at him in bewilderment, but eventually she began to laugh too. Just like the women in Alban's country, Algon, Valerie had also been taught to be meek and obedient, and to not try and be better than the men at anything. She thought this rule was rather unfair for most of her life, but now she no longer needed to obey it. I assume, she said, when they finished laughing, that the fact that your sweetheart could crush you with her thumb doesn't upset you then? Oh no, not really, he said, giving her a kiss just above her thumbnail. Though, it would be nice if you could occasionally let me handle these kinds of situations. I am a warrior, after all. I don't need a princess to save me every time. Very well, then. From now on, if we're ever attacked by some hideous giant monster or horde of barbarians, I'll pretend to be in some sort of peril, so that my brave, invincible warrior can come and save me. No, that isn't what I meant. It's all right, Alban, she said, laughing. I was only joking. I know what men are like. They always feel they have to show off to the girls in one way or another. But you don't have to show off to me. Just promise that you'll always be there for me, whenever I need you. Because I'll always be there for you. And I'll look out for you every way that I can. She pressed him into her lips, enjoying the feeling of his tiny body against her skin. Who needs a giant man, she thought, when you can have a little one like this, to hold in the palm of your hand and call your own? After she'd eaten breakfast, they both agreed that they have to go to the capital city of Elgon. Alban had been away from it for quite a while, and he would like to see his home again before he went back with Valerie to her land. He also knew that he had to go to the families of his friends and tell them about their deaths, which wasn't going to be easy, since he'll probably receive most of the blame. But most importantly, he was going to have to tell his father, the king, about Valerie. What the old man's reaction would be, Alban couldn't even begin to guess, but he had hoped that with all his heart that she would be accepted by his kinsmen, though this seemed extremely unlikely to him. Before setting off, Valerie put Alban on her shoulder, where he could hold on to her dress or her hair, and where it was unlikely that anyone on the ground below would see him. He was a bit uncomfortable at first, but soon got used to the ride, and enjoyed looking at both the countryside from this high vantage point, and at his beautiful princess, whose enormous face towered right beside him. She walked about as fast as a horse galloping at full speed, and he guessed it would only be a couple of days before they reached the royal city. She left the forests behind and began walking along a major road, keeping an eye out for other travelers. She met many, from soldiers to beggars, and every single one of them ran in terror when they saw her. Valerie just ignored them and kept walking. She didn't feel like trying to explain to every single one of them that they didn't have to be afraid of her. The next day, the countryside started to become less wild and more populated. Every now and then they would arrive at a small village or farming community, whose inhabitants, upon seeing the giantess approach in the distance, quickly hid themselves inside. A few of them dared to look out their windows, only to see a giant girl smiling and waving at them as she walked past them. Valerie always tried to walk around the towns, as she was afraid she accidentally would step on a person or a house if she tried to go through them. At last they had reached the capital of Elgon. It was a large city, several miles across, encircled by a wall 50 feet high. To one side there arose a large hill, and it was on this that the king's castle, Alban's home, was situated. Valerie kept following the road towards the main gate of the city, but soon realized this wasn't going to be easy. A large group of soldiers were waiting for her, at least several thousand, all armed with spears and bows, and there were also a large number of catapults. She stopped a few hundred feet away from them and looked down at Alban. "What's happening here?" she asked. "Did you know about this?" "No," he replied, uncertain if she was accusing him or not. "I swear I didn't know. They must have sent word ahead. Our messengers can travel as fast as you can, and they usually ride throughout the night as well. Please, let me go to them. I'll explain to them that you're not an enemy." She picked him up and held him before her eyes. "All right," she said. "I believe you. Go and talk to them if you want. But if any one of these soldiers decides to attack me, I won't hesitate to defend myself. Do you understand?" "Of course. You know I'll be there to defend you as well. I hope it won't come into conflict. I know many of these men. I'm sure they'll listen to me." She put him down carefully at her feet, then sat down and watched him head off towards the army. Looking behind her, she saw several crowds of people in the distance, though they were too far away to clearly see her. No doubt news of her had spread throughout the country by now, and she guessed that those were all the people who'd come to see for themselves if she was real. She was also blocking the road into the city, and people had stopped their travels in and out of the gates. So she reckoned that was another reason for the crowds. Alban had reached the edge of the contingent, and was immediately recognized by several officers in command there. An older man with a plumed helmet approached him, gasped in surprise, and embraced him. It was his uncle, Monar, his father's brother and general in the military. Unlike the king, Monar was a good-natured man, and Alban often felt more comfortable talking to him than his own father. "Thank the gods you're safe," the old man said. "We heard rumors that you were captured by that bastard Bargar. But when some of our troops arrived at his fortress, it was destroyed. We were afraid that you and your companions were dead." "Alas, uncle, I am the only survivor. My friends have all died during their travels, and I would have been dead too, if it weren't for her." He pointed towards Valerie, who was looking at all of them with interest, though she was too far away to tell what was going on. The general and his fellow commanders, and the rest of the soldiers standing nearby, all looked at Alban in wonder. "Saved you?" Monar exclaimed. "We thought you were that thing's prisoner. We've been hearing reports about a giant stalking the countryside, and it was carrying a man on its shoulder. Was that you?" "Yes, I was traveling with her. And she's not just any giant. She's the princess of Vandan, the last living member of her race. She doesn't want any hostility between her or us. She defeated Bargar and his legions single-handedly, and she rescued me from the dungeons." But why would she do something like that? What does she want from us?" "Nothing," Alban laughed. "You see, I rescued her first, from an ancient curse. A curse they say that only true love can break." "Uncle Monar, there's no other way for me to say this, so I'll just say it. I think I'm in love with her." Chaos suddenly erupted around them. From all sides, men were shouting at him, so much so that he couldn't make out anything that they were saying. The soldiers all seemed to forget that he was their prince, as they mobbed him relentlessly, until Monar yelled at them in order. He managed to get his men in line, and they made way for him, and Alban was able to pass through their ranks. The general offered Alban his horse and told him to hasten to the castle at once. "I don't know if what you say is true," Monar said, "but if it is, you had better tell the king at once. I will give the order that no one is to attack the giant, as long as she remains where she is. Alban." The old man paused and shook his head. "Alban, I've always loved you. You know that. And I would support you in anything you do. But this... It's all right, Uncle. I haven't gone mad, and I'm not trying to make a fool of you or anyone else. I was wary of Valerie at first. That's her name, Valerie. But I've gotten to know her well over the last few days. And more I begin to feel that she was the girl that I'm destined to live with, to be by my side. Even if she's much bigger than any of us, she's not our enemy. And if neither you nor my father accept her, then I'll leave with her, whether you wish me to or not." He rode off towards the city, and the general watched him go, completely dumbfounded by what he just heard. He couldn't imagine that any man, much less a warrior like Alban, would want to live with a woman the size of a battleship. But he had to admit, she was very beautiful, at least from this safe distance. He headed back to his soldiers and hoped that they wouldn't have to battle the giant princess. Chapter 6. Alban's father, Mildar, had been the ruler of Elgon for over 30 years. In all this time, he had required a great deal of many things that threatened his kingdom, but none of them had given him much more concern as the tale he just heard from his son. He and all of his subjects who were present in the throne room were utterly confounded. None of them could imagine that their future king was really intent on leaving his land to go live with a giant princess, with whom he had now fallen in love with. "No!" the king finally exclaimed, ending the silence that hung over the room. "There is no possible way, Alban, in which I would allow you to throw away your duties as my heir for such an preposterous notion. Whatever has gotten into your head, my boy? How could you ever think of something so deranged?" "Deranged? I'm not deranged, father, not even close. I'm sorry that Turris did not return, or any of the others. I don't think a day will pass from now on which I don't blame myself for their deaths. If you think I should be punished for their deaths, I agree. The only thing I wish is that you would welcome Valerie as a friend and ally of Elgon, and that you would accept the fact that we love each other, That's enough. I've heard enough. And I can see that it's going to take some time for you to get back to your senses. You will be punished in due time, but first, I want you to go off and tell that giant friend of yours that if she does not leave our lands at once, I shall order my forces to attack and kill her. There's never been a giant who was friendly to humans in all of history, and I strongly doubt that this, whatever she is any different." There were nods and voices of agreement from almost all the others inside the chamber. Alban felt his heart sink, even though he had already half expected this response before he arrived. He made his way towards the windows, not looking anyone in the eye, and wondered what he could say that could change his father's mind, even at least a little bit. Unfortunately, he could not think of anything, except that perhaps it would be a good idea to say goodbye. Back outside the city, Valerie had grown tired of sitting and waiting, and decided to get up and take a look around. As soon as she moved, the small army that had been watching her responded, and she saw a myriad of bows being drawn and catapults being loaded. But they weren't fast enough, as she easily walked past the soldiers who weren't able to keep up with her. She left them behind and headed towards the western edge of the city. On this side of the walls ran alongside the face of the castle hill, whose sides were steep and almost cliff-like. So close were the two structures that Valerie could almost touch the top of the castle if she stretched out her arm. She was standing right next to the wall, which only rose a little bit higher than her knees, On top of it, armed guards were running to and fro, some of them firing arrows at her, some running for their lives. She ignored them. She wasn't planning on staying long anyway, since that army was still heading in her direction. She wondered if Alban was in the castle right now, and what he was doing. "Oh, just shut up, will you?" she cried, after yet another one yelled, "Die, monster!" from the wall below. "I don't even look like a monster, and I certainly don't act like one." The guards stopped their futile attacks and looked up at her, frozen in their tracks. She crouched down so that the top of the wall was at eye level. Smiling at the frightened men, she carefully seized one of them by the waist and picked him up. He seemed scared beyond words, even though all she did was flick off his helmet and give him a kiss on the head. She put him back down again, and he promptly collapsed. "Some soldier you are," she laughed. "Frightened by a sweet lass like me, That's just not acceptable." She stopped upon hearing her name being shouted and looked up. High above her in one of the castle windows, she saw Prince Alban, leaning out and calling to her. She quickly stood up, but before she could ask him what was going on, he suddenly leapt out of the window and came plummeting down towards her. She had to react fast, but she managed to catch him safely in her hands. "Alban!" she exclaimed as he struggled to get back on his feet. "What's happening? Why did you just jump like that?" "We have to leave," he ordered her. "Right now. I tried to tell them, but they think you're here to destroy the city or something. My father has decided to attack you." He looked up, and sure enough, there was the king and his nobles watching from the throne room windows. Some of them were screaming, terrified at the sudden appearance of the giant right next to the castle. Meanwhile, the guards on the wall had regained their composure and began firing arrows again. Valerie turned around and, to her alarm, saw that she had lingered for too long. She was completely surrounded by the army, and even more men, both soldiers and commoners, had come out of the main gate to boost their ranks. She didn't think she was in any mortal danger, but the army was huge, and she was trapped, no way of escape, other than to fight her way through the legions of soldiers. Alban looked down from the safety of her cupped hand and regretted the decision to come here. They should have gone straight back to the Vandanian castle, but he had to introduce her to his people, foolishly thinking that they would all have the same change of heart that he had. He didn't want to ask Valerie to fight the soldiers, but he couldn't think of anything else to do. Looking up at the giant Valerie's face, he was surprised to see a look of determination on it. Had she thought of something? A plan to get out of this mess? She didn't say a word to him, but firmly put him on her shoulder, where he clutched onto a few strands of her brown hair. Valerie lifted each of her feet to shake off some pesky soldiers who were busy stabbing her with swords. She then turned around a few times, taking in the entire crowd at her feet, as well as the people in the castle, before addressing them. "Listen to me," she yelled, and they did. "I've just about had all I can take. How can an entire kingdom be so stupid? After all the care I had taken not to hurt anyone or break anything while traveling through your lands, you still think I'm here to kill and eat you. Seriously? I don't even want to stay here. I just came to say hello to my darling Prince Alban's family and to meet the people of his city, and maybe even offer my services to the King of Elgon as an ally. But I couldn't do any of those things because I'm constantly being bombarded with arrows and spears. Even after it should be obvious, you can't defeat me." As she said these last words, she stamped her feet hard on the ground. The circle of soldiers who were closest to her retreated hastily, and she had a bit more room to walk around in now. "I am not your enemy," she repeated, turning to face the king. "I am not here to invade you. In fact, it would be a great honor for me if some of your people would come and live with me in my land. Vandan's only inhabitants right now are goblins, and I wouldn't be much of a queen if I had an empty land to reign over. But I gather that you've already made up your minds about me, so I'll just leave you right now and cause you no further problems. She turned around and was glad that her speech seemed to have an effect upon the crowd. The ring of soldiers surrounding her seemed unable to make way for her, even after she asked them politely. So she simply nudged the front row of men with her toes, pushing them gently aside so that she could place her foot on the ground between them. Eventually they realized it would be impossible to stop her, so they moved aside and gave her enough space to walk through them. General Monar watched the giantess walk away, with his nephew still riding on her shoulder. Then he turned towards the castle, wondering how Mildar was going to react to this extraordinary situation. In his opinion, his brother had become a bit erratic in the last couple of years, sometimes making decisions without fully thinking them through. Usually he had to try and talk to his brother out of pursuing a particularly rash or unwise course of action, and he expected he'd have to do the same now. For his own part, he thought it would be best to order the soldiers not to pursue the giantess, whom he already regarded as a potential friend. That went well, Alban said sarcastically, as Valerie headed off on the journey back home. I'll be lucky if my father even wants to see me again after this, let alone talk to me. I'm sorry, Alban, Valerie said, taking him into her hand and holding him against her chest. I sort of knew something like this was going to happen, and I know that doesn't make it less harder to bear. But thank you for sticking me through everything. It really shows me what a wonderful man you are. He muttered, nestling against her breast. I never thought I'd fall in love with a giant, you know. What young lad would? Certainly not my father. He's been married 3 times, and he separated from them all when he was no longer attracted to them. I hardly ever see my mother anymore. She was his second wife. The first couldn't bear him a son. She listened to him talk about his relationships with his family, and thought it was no wonder that he preferred going on adventures to a life of court. There was too much unpleasantness that went on with that territory, it seemed, and she vowed that she and Alban would never stop respecting and loving each other, no matter how difficult or complicated their own lives might become. When it grew dark, she lay down next to a small forest, and they ate some bread and fruit from her sack. There was now only enough food for a couple of days, but she could walk fast, and knew that they could reach Vandan before it ran out. When they finished, Valerie took a few moments to tend to the wounds on her bare feet. The soldiers had been vicious in their attacks, and several of the sword cuts went deep. Alban offered his services to Valerie, and he decided to help rub her feet and help them heal with a magic lotion that she kept in her sack. I am definitely taking a bath once I get home, she sighed. A long, warm, relaxing bath. And after that, a nice long rest in my royal bed. That sounds marvelous, Alban said, as he rubbed some of the ointment she brought on the soles of her feet. In fact, I think I'll join you. Join me? In my bath? Now that's going a bit too far. She snatched him between finger and thumb and gave him a good firm squeeze. He made an attempt to break free, which didn't succeed in the slightest. So he gave up and let her have his way with him. She caressed him for a while before giving him a long, tender kiss. "Actually," she said, "I would love for you to join me. In my bath and in my bed. Big girls like me have desires too, you know." "I see. And can a minuscule man like me fulfill those great desires of yours?" "Oh, I think so. But there's only one way to be certain." She looked at him suggestively, and all of a sudden, Alban could no longer wait to get back to Vandan.